Have you ever caught yourself wondering how your money situation compares to everyone else's? Maybe it happens late at night when you're staring at your bank balance, trying to figure out if you're doing okay financially or if you're quietly falling behind. Or maybe it happens while scrolling through social media when you see people showing off vacations, new cars, expensive dinners, and lifestyles that seem way out of reach. In moments like that, it's easy to start asking yourself a simple but uncomfortable question. Am I doing better or worse than the average person? The truth is, most people have absolutely no idea where they stand financially compared to others. We tend to assume that everyone else has things figured out. It often looks like people around us are saving more money, investing smarter, and planning their future better. But appearances can be incredibly misleading when it comes to money. In reality, the financial lives of most people look very different from what you might expect. Behind the nice cars, the vacations, and the social media highlights, many people are dealing with stress about bills, debt, and long-term security. And that gap between what people show and what's actually happening with their finances is bigger than most of us realize. That's why understanding the real numbers matters so much. When you actually look at the data about income, spending habits, savings, debt, and retirement, you start to see a much clearer picture of how the average person is really doing. And once you understand that picture, something interesting happens. You begin to realize that beating the average financially might not be as impossible as it seems. In fact, in many cases, doing just a few things slightly better than most people can put you far ahead over time. But before we get into all the numbers and statistics that reveal what's really going on with people's finances, it's important to ask an honest question. When you imagine the typical person and their money situation, what does that picture look like in your mind? Do you imagine someone carefully managing their income, building savings every year, and steadily preparing for retirement? Or do you picture someone who's simply trying to get through the month, hoping the next paycheck arrives before the bills pile up too high? The answer might surprise you. To really understand how people are doing financially, the first place we need to look is income. After all, income is the starting point for everything else. It determines how much you can spend, how much you can save, and how quickly you can build wealth over time. But the interesting question is this: how much does the typical working person actually earn? If you look at recent labor data, the middle point for full-time workers sits at a little over $1,000 per week. When you stretch that across a full year of work, it lands somewhere around $52,000 before taxes. That number represents the middle of the pack. In other words, half of all workers earn more than that amount, and the other half earn less. At first glance, $52,000 might not sound terrible. In fact, for many people it might even sound fairly comfortable. But there's one important detail that often gets overlooked. That number represents income before taxes and deductions. Once federal taxes, state taxes, and payroll deductions are taken out, the amount that actually reaches someone's bank account can shrink a lot faster than people expect. Depending on where someone lives and how their taxes are structured, that original salary might turn into something closer to the mid-30,000 range in actual take-home pay. Suddenly, the financial picture starts to look very different. What once seemed like a decent income now has to cover rent or a mortgage, food, transportation, insurance, utilities, and every other daily expense. And that leads to an even bigger question. If this is what the typical person earns, what are they actually doing with the money once they receive it? Because income alone doesn't determine someone's financial future. What truly shapes a person's long-term financial stability is the way that money gets used after it arrives. And when we start looking at how people save, spend, and prepare for the future, the numbers become even more surprising. One of the most important places to look when judging someone's financial health is retirement savings. After all, sooner or later, every working person reaches a point where they no longer want to trade their time and energy for a paycheck. The big question is whether they will actually have enough money set aside to support themselves when that day comes. When researchers study retirement accounts across the country, the results can be a little surprising. The middle point for retirement savings sits somewhere around $60,000 to $70,000. At first glance, that might seem like a reasonable amount, but the story becomes much more interesting when you remember that this number includes people of all ages. Think about it for a moment. That figure represents workers in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and even people who are already close to retirement. When you look at it from that perspective, the amount suddenly feels much smaller than it first appeared. What makes the situation even more concerning is the number of people who haven't started saving at all. A large portion of adults don't even have a retirement account. No investment fund, no long-term savings plan, nothing set aside for the future. For them, retirement isn't something they're actively preparing for. Instead, it's something they hope will somehow work itself out later. Age also plays a huge role in how these numbers look. Younger workers often have only a small amount saved, which makes sense since they're just beginning their careers. But even among people who have been working for many years, the balances often remain far lower than financial experts recommend. And this raises an important question. If so many people are entering their later working years with relatively small retirement balances, what exactly are they planning to rely on once their paychecks stop? For many people, the answer to that question is surprisingly simple. They're expecting a government retirement benefit to carry most of the weight. Programs designed to support older citizens provide a monthly payment to millions of retirees. And for a large number of people, this check becomes their primary source of income once they stop working. On average, these monthly payments land somewhere in the range of $1,500. Over the course of a year, that adds up to a little under $19,000. While that income can certainly help cover basic living expenses, it's rarely enough to support the lifestyle most people imagine for their retirement years. Think about the typical monthly costs people face. Housing, food, healthcare, utilities, transportation, and other everyday expenses can add up quickly. Even if someone owns their home outright and doesn't have a mortgage payment anymore, the total cost of living can still be significant. Another thing many people overlook is that not everyone receives the same benefit. The amount someone qualifies for depends heavily on how much they earned during their working years and how long they remained in the workforce. People with gaps in employment or lower incomes often receive much smaller payments. Because of this uncertainty, some financial planners suggest a different mindset altogether. Instead of depending entirely on that monthly check, they recommend treating it as a backup plan rather than the foundation of retirement. In other words, any money that arrives from that program should be viewed as helpful support, not the main engine funding someone's lifestyle. Once you start thinking about retirement that way, another question naturally appears. If those payments alone may not be enough, how are people managing their money during their working years right now? To understand the full financial picture, we also need to look at how much money people spend in their everyday lives. Earning income is only one side of the equation. What truly determines whether someone moves forward financially or stays stuck is how much of that income disappears through monthly expenses. When economists analyze household budgets, they find that the typical family spends a little over $5,000 each month. Spread across an entire year, that comes out to roughly $67,000 in total expenses. That number alone tells an important story. For a household to simply break even, their take-home pay must be at least that high. And remember, this is after taxes. So the income required to support that level of spending is actually much higher than many people realize. The largest portion of that budget usually goes toward housing. Rent or mortgage payments, property taxes, utilities, insurance, and maintenance together form the biggest financial responsibility for most families. On average, housing alone can take close to $2,000 every month. Over the course of a year, that adds up to more than $20,000 just to keep a roof overhead. The next major category is food. Groceries combined with restaurant spending can easily reach several $100s each month. Feeding a family consistently throughout the year becomes a surprisingly large part of the household budget. Transportation also plays a significant role. Car payments, fuel, insurance, repairs, and public transit costs often combine to create another major monthly expense. When you add these three categories together, housing, food, and transportation, you begin to see how quickly income gets absorbed by basic living costs. And once those essentials are covered, there are still plenty of other expenses waiting in line. After covering the basic necessities like housing, food, and transportation, most households still face a long list of additional expenses. Utilities, phone bills, internet service, insurance, healthcare costs, clothing, entertainment, and small everyday purchases all continue to pull money out of the monthly budget. Individually, many of these expenses don't seem very large. But when they repeat month after month, the total can become surprisingly significant. Because of this constant flow of spending, many people find themselves living extremely close to the edge financially. A single unexpected event, a medical bill, a car repair, or a temporary loss of income, can suddenly create serious financial pressure. This is one reason financial experts often stress the importance of building an emergency fund. But there is another factor that can quietly influence someone's financial stability, and that's their credit history. In today's world, credit plays a major role in everyday financial life. It affects whether someone can qualify for a loan, how much interest they will pay, and sometimes even their ability to rent an apartment or secure certain jobs. Credit scores typically fall within a range that stretches from the low 300s up to the mid 800s. The higher the number, the more trustworthy someone appears to lenders. When researchers look at national data, they find that the average score lands somewhere in the low 700s, which is generally considered a solid position. This suggests that many people are doing at least a few things correctly. Paying bills on time, keeping balances manageable, and avoiding excessive borrowing can help maintain a healthy credit profile. However, even with decent credit scores, there's one particular type of debt that continues to cause serious financial trouble for many households. One of the biggest financial traps many households fall into involves revolving debt, especially the kind tied to everyday spending cards. At first, these cards seem incredibly convenient. They allow people to make purchases instantly and worry about payment later. For small purchases here and there, it might not seem like a big deal. But over time, those balances can quietly grow into something much larger than expected. Studies show that the typical household carries several $1,000s in balance on these types of accounts. In many cases, the total climbs close to 5 figures. What makes this situation especially difficult is the interest attached to that balance. Unlike mortgages or student loans, these interest rates are often extremely high. It's not unusual to see annual interest rates climb into the 20% range or even higher. When that happens, the debt can start growing much faster than people realize. Instead of making progress, borrowers sometimes end up paying mostly interest while the original balance barely moves. To put that into perspective, imagine carrying a balance of $9,000 with a high interest rate attached to it. Over the course of a year, a large chunk of money could disappear just to cover interest charges alone. That's money that could have been saved, invested, or used to reduce other financial pressures. What makes this even more frustrating is that much of this debt often comes from purchases that lose value quickly. Clothes, gadgets, takeout meals, and impulse buys might feel exciting in the moment, but months later the items are often forgotten while the bill remains. And when debt begins to pile up like this, it has a direct impact on another financial number that tells the bigger story of someone's overall financial health. That number is net worth. When people talk about true financial health, one number matters more than almost any other: net worth. Unlike income, which only tells you how much money flows in each year, net worth shows the bigger picture of someone's overall financial position. Calculating it is actually very simple. First, you add up everything you own. This might include money in bank accounts, investments, retirement funds, property, vehicles, and any other valuable assets. Then you subtract everything you owe, such as loans, credit balances, or other debts. The amount left over after that calculation is your net worth. Across the country, the middle point for household net worth sits a little above $100,000. At first glance, that might sound fairly strong. But just like many other financial statistics, the real story becomes clearer when you break it down by age group. Younger adults often start with relatively small net worth figures. People in their 20s or early 30s may still be paying off student loans or just beginning to build savings. Because of that, their total wealth might only reach the low tens of thousands. As people move into their late 30s and 40s, their net worth tends to grow faster. Careers become more stable, incomes often rise, and long-term investments begin to accumulate. By the time individuals reach their 50s and early 60s, many have had decades to grow their assets. But even with that additional time, the numbers are often lower than many people expect. For some households, progress is slowed by debt, unexpected expenses, or simply not saving enough over the years. And this brings us to another important piece of the financial puzzle: how much of their income people are actually setting aside for the future. When it comes to building long-term financial security, one habit matters more than almost anything else: saving. No matter how much someone earns, if very little of that income is set aside, it becomes extremely difficult to build meaningful wealth over time. Surprisingly, when economists examine national data, they find that the average person saves only a small portion of what they earn. After taxes and everyday spending are taken into account, the typical savings rate sits somewhere around 6% of income. In simple terms, for every $100 someone earns, only about $6 ends up being saved. At first, that might not seem terrible, but when you think about the financial goals most people hope to achieve, that number suddenly starts to feel very small. Major life expenses require significant amounts of money. Buying a home often requires a large down payment. Renovations, medical expenses, education costs, and even replacing a vehicle can require tens of thousands of dollars. If someone is saving only a small percentage of their income, it can take many years just to reach one of those goals. And during that time, unexpected events can easily slow progress even further. Because of this, many financial planners recommend setting aside a larger portion of income, especially for long-term goals like retirement. Some suggest aiming for 10 to 15% each year if possible. The earlier someone begins building this habit, the more powerful it becomes. This is because time allows savings to grow through compounding, where money begins generating additional money on its own. Over decades, even steady and consistent contributions can turn into substantial amounts. Which leads to another important question. After working and saving for so many years, when do most people actually step away from the workforce and begin retirement? Most people assume retirement happens around the age of 65, but the reality is a little different. Recent studies show that the average person in the U.S. actually stops working somewhere closer to 61. At first, that might sound like a dream. 6 extra years of freedom compared to traditional retirement age. But here's the catch. Full government retirement benefits typically don't kick in until a later age. That means there's often a gap between when paychecks stop and when guaranteed income begins. For many, that gap can create serious financial pressure, especially if savings are limited. Remember the retirement balances we discussed earlier? Median amounts often fall far short of what's needed to cover decades of living expenses. Even a modest lifestyle can be hard to maintain if income is insufficient. And it doesn't stop there. Life expectancy continues to rise, which means that retirees may need to fund 20, 25, or even 30 years without a regular paycheck. This is where the numbers become a real wake-up call. The average person, with minimal retirement savings and lingering debt, faces a future where basic needs could outpace available income. But the good news is that understanding these statistics doesn't have to feel discouraging. In fact, knowing the reality gives anyone a huge advantage. Once you see where the average person ends up financially, it becomes clear what actions you can take to do better. Simple steps: saving more than average, avoiding unnecessary debt, consistently investing, and being intentional with spending can dramatically improve your financial future. Small advantages in multiple areas compound over time, pushing you far ahead of the typical scenario. The key takeaway: average is not destiny. You can choose to be smarter, more disciplined, and more strategic with your money. Doing so doesn't require a huge income or insider knowledge. It only requires making informed decisions and acting consistently.